So, hello there. Welcome to part 7 of this series on Jesus and the Bible, the brutal facts. I've changed the title as we've gone along, as you may have realized. So, let's get cracking on the evidence of the missing body. Was Jesus's body really absent from his tomb? So, for this section, we're going to rely on the expertise of William Lane Craig, an outstanding theologian and debater, internationally known for his writings on the intersection of science, philosophy, and theology. The issue with Jesus isn't that he was nowhere to be seen. It's that he was seen alive, he was seen dead, and he was seen alive once more. The empty tomb, as an enduring symbol of the resurrection, is the ultimate representation of Jesus' claim to deity. The Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15:17 that the resurrection is the very linchpin of the Christian faith. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. Therefore, the resurrection is the supreme vindication of Jesus' divine identity and his inspired teaching, the proof of his triumph over sin and death, and the foreshadowing of the resurrection of his followers. And the basis of Christian hope, it's the miracle of all miracles. No one else in history has revived themselves from the dead. The burial is mentioned by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, where he passes on a very early creed of the church. This is quite important. We'll go into it in more detail. This goes back to within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion, having been given to Paul after his conversion in Damascus or in his subsequent visit to Jerusalem, when he met with the apostles James and Peter. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 dates back to just after the crucifixion, as I've said. So for what I have received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. The creed then goes on to list several appearances of the resurrected Jesus. It's incredibly early and therefore trustworthy material. Essentially, it's a 4-line formula. When we turn to the Gospels, we find multiple independent attestations of this burial story, and Joseph of Arimathea is specifically named in all 4 accounts. Mark, when you get to the last week of Jesus' life, the so-called Passion story, Mark begins throughout the Gospel with short anecdotes about Jesus' life, like pearls on a string. But when you get to the Passion story, you have a continuous narrative of events in sequence. This narrative was apparently taken by Mark from an even earlier source. And this source included the story of Jesus being buried in the tomb. The last week of Jesus' life becomes that narrative. So the question we have, the entire Sanhedrin voted to condemn Jesus, as stated in Mark, which means that Joseph of Arimathea cast his ballot to kill Jesus. Luke would have felt the same discomfort, which is why he had an important detail. What is it that Luke said? Now, there was a man named Joseph from the Jewish town of Arimathea. He was a member of the council, a good and righteous man who had not consented to their decision and action. And he was looking for the kingdom of God. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. If you're not aware, Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate, asked for the body of Jesus, and buried Jesus in his own tomb in a garden, in a beautiful garden. So the question by skeptics is, well, why would this man who voted to have Jesus killed, then go and bury him in his own tomb? Well, it's highly improbable that Jews would have invented this story and invented that Joseph of Arimathea did the right thing, because they are actually very irritated with the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin. Yeah. Bar John, everyone else had abandoned Jesus during his passion. So deserted him. So it would be unlikely that they would make up that it was Joseph of Arimathea who went to get his body if it hadn't been him. And if this burial were a legend, then that developed years later, you'd expect to find other competing burial traditions about what happened to Jesus' body. However, you don't find these at all. The majority of New Testament scholars today agree that the burial account of Jesus is fundamentally reliable. So, thinking about the claims and counterclaims about the resurrection that went back and forth between the Christians and the Jews in the first century, were there definitely guards at the tomb? So let's look at these claims and counterclaims. On the one hand, you have the Christians, and the other hand, the Jews. Jesus is risen, say the Christians. The disciples stole his body, said the Jews. But the guards at the tomb would have prevented such a theft. But the guards at the tomb fell asleep. No, the Jews bribed the guards to say they fell asleep. Now, if there had not been any guards, the exchange would have gone like this. Jesus is risen. The disciples stole his body. But the guards at the tomb would have prevented such a theft. What guards? You're crazy. Yet history tells us that's not what the Jews said. This suggests that the guards really were historical and that the Jews knew it, which is why they had to invent the absurd story about the guards having been asleep while the disciples took his body. Now, there are numerous comments that have been made by skeptics that there are apparent discrepancies in the narratives of the gospel accounts. For example, Charles Templeton has said the 4 descriptions of events after Jesus's crucifixion differ so markedly at so many points that with all the goodwill in the world, they cannot be reconciled. Even the usually skeptical historian Michael Grant, a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and professor at Edinburgh University, concedes in his book, Jesus, A Historian's Review of the Gospels. True, the discovery of the empty tomb is differently described by the various Gospels, but if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. And with these multiple and independent accounts, no historian would disregard this evidence just because of secondary discrepancies. And we can look at a similar example where there have been discrepancies in the story, in a secular case. You've all heard about Hannibal. We have 2 incompatible and irreconcilable narratives of Hannibal crossing the Alps to attack Rome. Yet no classical historian doubts the fact that Hannibal did mount such a campaign. That's a non-biblical illustration of discrepancies in secondary details failing to undermine the historical core of a historical story. Can the witnesses be trusted? The Gospels agree that the empty tomb was discovered by a woman. But in the estimation of Michael Martin, this makes their testimony suspect since they were probably not objective observers. Well, let's take a look at that. Firstly, this argument backfires on itself because they were friends and followers of Jesus who arrived at the tomb first. They would have, in fact, not declared it had they thought that they were themselves involved. The testimony was regarded as so worthless at the time of women in Israel or in the Palestine. They were on such a low rung of the social ladder that their testimony was regarded as worthless. So worthless, in fact, that they weren't even allowed to serve as legal witnesses in a Jewish court of law. There are old rabbinical sayings that said, "Let the words of the law be burned rather than delivered to women, and blessed is he whose children are male, but woe to him whose children are female." Therefore, any legendary account would have portrayed male disciples as discovering the tomb, not women, i.e. Peter or John or any of them. But that's not what happened. Okay. So this is further proof that the gospel writers faithfully recorded what happened, even if it was embarrassing. And in every case, it was women that discovered the tomb first, in all of the gospel accounts. What affirmative evidence is there for the empty tomb? What are the key arguments for the tomb being historical fact, an empty tomb being historical fact? Well, it's absolutely implicit in the early tradition passed along by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, which we've already seen, very old and reliable source of info on Jesus. The unanimous testimony that the empty tomb was discovered by women also argues for the authenticity of the story. Then there's the language, grammar, and style of Mark, which indicates a much earlier source having been used, i.e. before AD 37, free of corruption. The story is stark and unadorned by theological reflection. A.N. Sherwin-White, the respected Greco-Roman classical historian from Oxford University, said, "It would have been without precedent anywhere in history for legend to have grown up that fast and significantly distorted the Gospels." I love this point. This site was known to Christians and Jews alike. If the tomb weren't empty, then it would have been absolutely impossible for a movement founded on the remarkable claim of a resurrection to grow and flourish in the very same city of the execution and burial. Absolutely impossible. And lastly, nobody claimed the body remained in the tomb. No one. The question always was, what happened to it? The Jews claimed the body was taken because the tomb was vacant. Fact, not fiction. Isn't it completely preposterous to believe that Jesus was God incarnate who was raised from the dead? It can be absolutely impossible to believe it if you're almost convinced or completely convinced that God can't exist. However, the issue of the raising of the dead is no longer a historical issue. It's a philosophical one regarding whether miracles are possible. Okay? Based on the evidence, what is highly improbable is the hypothesis that Jesus spontaneously came back to life and rose naturally from the dead by himself. This wouldn't contradict science or any known facts of experience, the resurrection itself. All it requires is the hypothesis that God exists and raised Jesus from the dead. Indeed, in the face of the facts, critics have been impotent to put Jesus' body back in the tomb. As Sir Norman Anderson said, and this is a towering legal intellect, of one of the towering legal intellects of all time, Cambridge-educated Sir Norman Anderson lectured at Princeton University, was offered a professorship for life at Harvard University, and served as Dean of the Faculty of Laws at the University of London. His conclusion, after a lifetime of analyzing the issue from a legal perspective, was summed up in this sentence: "The empty tomb then forms a veritable rock on which all rationalistic theories of the resurrection dash themselves in vain." So critics flounder, they struggle, they snatch at straws, they contradict themselves, they pursue desperate and extraordinary theories to try to account for the evidence, yet each time, in the end, the tomb remains vacant. What then was the evidence of a resurrected Jesus? Was Jesus seen alive after his death on the cross? Gary Habermas is, again, an outstanding theologian and debater. I've seen several of his debates on YouTube, and I would recommend them. If you haven't seen him, an absolute pit bull of a debater and truly expert in his field. The missing body isn't proof in itself. Many facts are needed to establish that Jesus really did return from the dead, because nobody actually saw Jesus start to move, sit up, remove the linen wrappings, fold them, roll them back, roll back the stone, and wow the guards and leave. However, science is the study of causes and their effects. We don't see dinosaurs, we study their fossils. Even if nobody witnesses a crime, police may piece together the evidence after the fact, as we know. So, nobody questions that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, where he affirms in 2 places that he personally encountered the resurrected Christ. Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus, our Lord? And last of all, As to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Attached to the early church creed, we've seen the first part of it, verses 3 and 4, which refers to Jesus' execution, burial, and resurrection. The final part, verses 5 to 8, deals with his post-resurrection appearances. Christ appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. This is incredibly influential testimony that Jesus did appear alive after his death. There are the names of specific individuals and groups of people who saw him, written at a time when people could still check them out if they wanted confirmation. And that's really important to bear in mind. It would have been almost impossible to lie in those days. You'd have been called to task and probably even, prosecuted for lying or bearing false witness. So what is it this is about the creed? Convince me it's a creed. What are they truly saying in this creed? Well, the eminent scholar Joachim Jeremias refers to this creed as the earliest tradition of all. Ulrich Wilkins says it indubitably goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity. So, why is it a creed? Well, first of all, Paul introduces it with the words received and delivered, which are technical rabbinic terms indicating he's passing along holy tradition. Then there's the text parallelism and stylized content, which indicates it's a creed. There's the original text, which uses Cephas, which is Peter in Aramaic, right? And in fact, the Aramaic itself can indicate a very early origin. Then the creed uses several other primitive phrases that Paul would not customarily use, like the 12, the third day, he was raised, and others. So that indicates it hasn't come from Paul himself. Then there's the style of the narration. The use of certain words is similar to Aramaic and Mishnaic Hebrew in terms of the means of narration. And finally, there is scholarly agreement. The assessment is that this is an early creed which is shared by conservative Christians as well as a wide range of scholars worldwide. How old is the creed? Well, this is incredibly early, primitive, unadorned testimony to the fact that Jesus appeared alive to skeptics like Paul, because first of all, Paul wrote 1 Corinthians between AD 55 to 57. Paul passes the creed to the church in Corinth, however, in AD 51, so it must predate his visit. He'd already passed it on by then. So the creed was being used within 20 years of the resurrection. Various scholars actually trace it back further to within 2 to 8 years of the resurrection when Paul received it, either in Damascus or Jerusalem. Okay? So really primitive testimony. In around AD 38, Paul describes in Galatians 1, 18 to 19, his meeting in Jerusalem with Peter and James. He uses a very interesting Greek word which is historio. This means that there was an investigative inquiry and Paul was playing the role of examiner, someone who was carefully checking this out. So the fact that Paul personally confirmed matters with 2 eyewitnesses who are specifically mentioned in the creed, Peter and James, gives this extra weight. Paul conducted an investigation. One of the very few Jewish New Testament scholars, Pinchas Lapide, says the evidence in support of the creed is so strong that it may be considered as a statement of eyewitnesses. What about the 500, which was mentioned by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15? 1 Corinthians 15 is the only place in ancient literature where it's claimed that Jesus appeared to 500 people at once. Yet the Gospels don't corroborate it anywhere. No secular mentions it. Surely the apostles would cite this as evidence wherever they went. Atheist Michael Martin states one must conclude that it is extremely unlikely that this incident really occurred and that this therefore indirectly cast doubt on Paul as a reliable source. So why doesn't anyone else talk about it? Why doesn't anyone else talk about the 500? Well, first of all, even though it's only one reported source, it just so happens to be the earliest and best authenticated passage of all. Paul apparently either knew these people, because he says most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep, or was told by someone who knew them that they were still available to be interviewed, hence the phrase, with absolute confidence, that he's stated there. Overall, the creed's credibility therefore remains intact. It's early and free from legendary contamination. It's unambiguous and specific, and it's ultimately rooted in eyewitness accounts. The weight of the evidence clearly and convincingly supports the creed as being powerful evidence for Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. So powerful that William Lane Craig, the resurrection expert who we've seen earlier in the presentation, said that Wolfhart Pannenberg, perhaps the greatest living systematic theologian in the world, has rocked modern skeptical German theology by building his entire theology precisely on the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus as supplied in Paul's list of appearances. Several different appearances over several weeks to a lot of different people in the Gospels and Acts. Some individually, some in groups, some indoors, some outdoors, to soft-hearted people like John and skeptical people like Thomas. There are good reasons to trust these accounts. They are lacking in many typical mythical tendencies and are as follows. Well, first, we have Mary Magdalene, mentioned in John. In actual fact, if you read the accounts of the mystics, Jesus, of course, appeared to his mother first of all, but that's not in the gospel. Then he appeared to other women in Matthew 28. Then he appeared to the two travelers, two of the disciples who were disheartened and leaving Jerusalem on the road to Emmaus, Cleopas and one other. Then he appeared to Simon. Then he appeared to the apostles minus Thomas, minus doubting Thomas, where he appeared at dinner. Then he appeared to all of them, and Thomas was invited to place his fingers in the Lord's wounds. Then he appeared on the lake, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, while the apostles were fishing. And then he appeared again in Galilee on a hill. And finally, on his day of ascension, he appeared to many. Now, actually, if you read the mystics such as Anne Catherine Emmerich or Valtorta, Anne Catherine Emmerich states specifically that there were at least 500 people on the Mount of Olives watching Jesus ascend into heaven. Of note, C.H. Dodd, the Cambridge University scholar, has carefully analysed these appearances and concluded that several of them are based on especially early material, which are those marked in blue, where he appears to the other women, the apostles, and in Galilee. Okay, so you have multiple appearances to multiple people. And what does this mean specifically? Well, first of all, let's look at some things that Peter said. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we're all witnesses of the fact. So Peter, again, puts his pen to paper and says that I have seen the Lord, and we have seen the Lord. You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are witnesses of this. And then he confirms to Cornelius that he and the others ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead in chapter 10. And then you've also got Paul saying, for many days he was seen by those who traveled with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. They are now his witnesses to our people. Okay, so the New Testament book, which records the launch of the church, Jesus' appearance are mentioned regularly. Details are provided in numerous places. And the theme of the disciples being a witness of these things is found in almost every context. Could these have been hallucinations? Well, that's a fair challenge because hallucinations are known to occur. However, hallucinations are individual. They cannot be a group phenomenon. Only one person can see a given hallucination at a time. Secondly, they are not inducible in others. A hallucinating person cannot induce a hallucination in somebody else. They are subjective and personal. That's a big problem for the hallucination theory because Jesus appeared to multiple people who all repeated the same thing. Furthermore, post-crucifixion, the disciples were fearful, doubtful, and in despair. People who hallucinate need a fertile mind of expectancy or anticipation. Peter was hard-headed and James was a skeptic, so not good candidates for hallucinations. Finally, hallucinations are comparably rare, usually caused by drugs or bodily deprivation. We're supposed to believe, therefore, that over a course of many weeks, people from all sorts of backgrounds, temperaments in various places, all experimented hallucinations and of exactly the same theme? Not likely. And if they were hallucinations, why was Jesus' body still not in the grave? If they only thought they saw him. A person full of religious zeal may see what he or she wants to see, not what is really there. Michael Martin, a clear atheist in his case against Christianity. Well, that's a double-edged sword. And actually, it was an atheist that provided the next phrase because it had been used against him so many times when he brought up the first one in red. And that is that Christians believe because they want to, but atheists don't believe because they don't want to. So what are the conclusions on the direct evidence? The resurrection was the central proclamation of the early church from the very beginning. The amount of testimony and corroboration is absolutely staggering. The earliest Christians didn't just endorse Jesus' teachings, they were convinced that they'd seen him alive after his crucifixion. That's what changed their lives and started the early church. Certainly, since this was their centermost conviction, they would have made absolutely sure it was true because their whole church was founded on it. But if you were to interrogate each of the direct witnesses for just 15 minutes without breaks, and there were some 540 of them, it would take more than 2 weeks to conclude this in a court of law. Who wouldn't be convinced after listening to 129 straight hours of eyewitness testimony that Jesus had in fact been seen resurrected from the dead? The amount of testimony and corroboration of Jesus' post-resurrection is absolutely staggering. All of the gospel and Acts provide evidence, incident after incident, witness after witness, detail after detail, corroboration on top of corroboration. Has there ever been a more thoroughly attested event in ancient history? Sometimes people grasp at straws trying to explain appearances, but nothing fits all the evidence better than the explanation that Jesus was alive. Sir Edward Clarke, a British High Court judge who conducted his own thorough legal analysis of the first Easter day, said the following: "To me, the evidence is conclusive, and over again in the High Court, I have secured the verdict on evidence not nearly so compelling. As a lawyer, I accept the gospel evidence unreservedly as the testimony of truthful men to facts that they were able to substantiate." Then prominent theologian and historian Carl Bratton said, "Even the more skeptical historians agree that for primitive Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead was a real event in history, the very foundation of faith and not a mythical idea arising out of the creative imagination of believers." And lastly, another prominent British theologian Michael Green said, "The appearances of Jesus are as well authenticated as anything in antiquity. There can be no rational doubt that they occurred, and that the main reason why Christians became sure of the resurrection in the earliest days was just this. They could say with assurance, 'We have seen the Lord.' They knew it was he." That ends this part of the presentation. I will launch into the next part in a separate video. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will see you soon.